You're listening to the 23rd broadcast of TBR Radios, the TBR History Hour, with your host, TBR contributing editor, Dr. Edward DeVries. On today's show, Dr. Ed talks with attorney Keith Alexander, the co-host of the popular radio show, The Political Cesspool.
I guess go ahead and start our interview by telling us about the radio work that you're doing and kind of a little bit about yourself.
Okay, well, James and I have been together on this show, probably since about 2007. I remember that his show was advertised in the Citizens Informer, the Council of Conservative Citizens newspaper, and I got a copy of that and tuned into it, and it was interesting, and called in one day, and he and his partner at the time, Bill Rowland, who has since passed on, said, we need to get this guy on the show. So one thing led to another, and I've been since 2007.
So how did the name Political Cesspool come to be the name of that radio show?
Well, that was done before my involvement. There was a guy named Austin Farley and James who were running for political office, local political office at the time, I think the state legislature. And after that run, they decided that there was a need for a paleo-conservative radio show because they didn't know of any, so they started it. And Austin bailed out after, probably about a year, but James held on to it and kept doing it, and it's basically continued on and grown and has quite a following. We have people from that listen and contribute basically over the internet from Finland to Brazil.
Tell me then, was it the show always kind of as it is now? Was it a very strong nationalist voice, or was nationalism something that you and James and other people involved with the radio show over the years have kind of grown into?
Well, I think we're instinctively nationalist and populist and Southern and Christian. And that's just organic. That comes from us. That's our instincts. And as a result of that, calling card of the show, and there are a lot of people, not only in the American South, but throughout the world, that appreciate that viewpoint. We're supported entirely by people who didn't like what they were hearing. We wouldn't be getting the donations, and we wouldn't be on the air, probably.
Right. Well, I know how that goes, especially when the whole pandemic thing really started to take off. There went a couple weeks, people weren't buying books, people weren't paying their advertising bills, and it was like, oh my, what's going to happen here? And somebody just sent in a donation, and they said, hey, we like the work that Ed's doing on TBR Radio. We don't want him to go away.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of wealthy contributors like the left seems to be able to find, but nonetheless, I think if it were not for the internet, it would be hard to find people with our viewpoint out there in the media getting the message across. I think the internet has been a great boon to all of us. And I guess the other thing is that since all these media groups are cutting off our access, PayPal and stuff like this for getting paid, we need to be thankful for the U.S. Postal Service continuing to be a resource that people can use to send us money.
Well, most people who listen don't even think about that. I mean, they go to church and they, they obviously realize the importance of giving an offering to, for that, or they go, maybe there's some organization that they receive some great benefit from. Maybe they give an extra donation to the Little League in addition to whatever it costs to sign their kid up, or maybe they give money to the school in addition to the property taxes that they pay because, they want to see stuff happen there, but they don't even think to, give donation to like my radio show or to your radio show. They don't realize that, like a lot of those other organizations and groups, we're literally, riding by the seat of our financial pants and they don't even think to support it.
Of course, the other problem is that, they're used to not having to pay for information. They just turn on the radio or the TV or the internet and it comes across. And of course, the left is well funded. Right. And it's always been a mystery to me as to why that is. And perhaps its power and influence pays money, uses its money to great effect to affect politics and public opinion. And as a result, all the left-wingers, they don't have to have any support out in the public virtually, but they can get financed and paid to do what they do because powerful people apparently want that message to come across, and they don't want ours. Okay, so we're totally a grassroots organization, like I'm sure you are.
Well, you look at advertising, and that's where radio, television, you talk about people are just so used to, they turn on the radio, they turn on the TV, they get information, they don't pay for it. And the reason for that is advertising, and, for whatever reason, if it's because they're afraid of boycotts, or if it's because they have liberals on their board of directors, or whatever the reason is, companies that pay the big bucks to advertise on radio and television, they will not advertise on a radio show like ours. They just won't do it.
Political correctness is the reason for that, I believe, Ed. And political correctness is the enforcement mechanism of cultural Marxism. And the cultural Marxism is diabolically clever. Political correctness as an enforcement mechanism is much more effective than, let's say, the terror tactics of communism. We don't have to worry about somebody knocking on our door at midnight and carrying us down to the basement of the Lubyanka and putting a bullet in the base of our brain, like opponents of communist regimes in the past have had to deal with. But that type of terror engenders a response. On the other hand, if political correctness just says, if you persist in expressing these viewpoints, you might lose your job, you might not have a career, you might not be invited to the right cocktail parties and stuff like this. And that seems to be something that people will tolerate. Particularly, it affects women. If you're married or if you have a girlfriend, they don't like that. I found it very interesting to read about Charles Lindbergh, and basically the most pushback he got to his activism was from his wife, and his wife really supported him, but she just could not stand being a social pariah, and that's what political correctness does.
Even Rush Limbaugh or Tucker Carlson, guys who don't go near as far or push the envelope near as far as we do. There are a lot of these people that won't even advertise with them, in spite of the fact that Rush Limbaugh, for example, has the largest radio audience in America. And they won't advertise with them. They will pay millions to advertise on a show that nobody watches or listens to. And, Rush Limbaugh could not give them advertising because they don't want to be associated with the things that he's saying. And again, he's not even pushing the envelope nearly as far as we are.
Well, look, it's basically mass hysteria or mass mental illness, I believe. But there is the fact that our people, despite the way we're advertised by our opponents, are nonviolent people, where the left has Antifa, people that will go out there and try to dox people, ruin their careers, or else, attack them or vandalize or attack their property or go after their children and whatnot and try to affect their prospects in life. So, for whatever reason, people fear the power of the left. But I've always said that, we need to just affect people in pocketbook issues. I've always said that the only sound a liberal truly fears is the click of a closing purse. But we don't seem to be able to organize boycotts the way that the left does. And they're just more organized, more effective, and that's because they have money behind them. And if somebody, for example, wants to be a journalist and wants to get paid for it, they're going to have to be a left-winger. And, they've had organizations like the Intercollegiate Studies Institute that was supposed to be developing conservative journalists, and what they did was they developed people that started out conservative and quickly flipped over to being leftists, and the reason was that was the requirement for having a paying job. So, it's a conundrum. We have a lot more people saying things from our vantage point now than we had, let's say, 30, 40 years ago. And that's because of the internet. the internet has been the great boon for us. I wish that there was some way to discover the secret sauce that would allow us to have financial resources on a par with the left, but so far no one seems to have been able to come up with that. And there are a lot of wealthy millionaires that will, like George Soros, that will support the left, but there are few people on the right that will do that, and those that are, the people that have access to them, guard that information, jealously. They're not going to pass that out to help other people. So basically, it's I guess another thing is that you can't leave money and get tax breaks for supporting right-wing organizations. You know, the old segregation academies in the South that developed after busing learned that. One of the first things that the left did was go after the IRS to prevent them from having 501c3 status where people could contribute money to them and get a tax break or a tax deduction for it. So, the left is in charge. All this shows that who is really in charge of American society and Western society today, and it's not conservatives, it's not nationalists, and it's not populists. It's globalists, liberal elitists that are in charge of everything. The exact opposite of what we are.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Well, I'm going to throw another something out there, and you can comment on it, and that is sometimes I wonder if even the conservatives in the media are really conservative, or if they're just actors and actresses who pretend to be conservative just so that there's the appearance of a debate and a discussion. And the reason I say that, and I don't want to, I don't know, there's part of me that is hesitant to be critical, but there's another part of me that just needs to throw it out there. Like, for example, Laura Ingraham, and normally I like to listen to her radio show. Of course, she's not doing it anymore, but, watch her on Fox News in the evenings and so forth. And I normally like the things that she says, but if you look down at the list of her life, I don't think she's ever had a boyfriend who wasn't a flaming liberal. And so if she really believes the things she says she believes, how could she be dating these flaming liberals from CNN and CBS and MSNBC? I mean, or Sean Hannity, who talks about the Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms, but yet as soon as you have an armed militia that overtakes the State House in Michigan to say enough is enough, he's saying, oh, well, you shouldn't have shown up with guns. You might have endangered some poor policeman's life.
Well, look, even Ann Coulter, who was her boyfriend, it was Kid Dynamite, that black guy. I forget what his name was. It was in that TV series back in the 70s. She's never married. Rush Limbaugh has had serial monogamy, basically, a bunch of different wives. I don't know if there's something about women that they don't like to link up with unpopular causes. I think that it's not an accident that the first big initiative of the left in modern age was women's suffrage, because by getting women the vote, they basically watered down the common sense of the electorate by 50% with one fell swoop. Women, I think, want to be considered nice, most women, above all else, and unfortunately the left has cornered the market on niceness, so that's part of that problem. The other thing is that if you are in journalistic or the media industry and you're getting paid, at least 9/10, and probably more of those people are going to be real liberals. Also, you're right, neo-conservatism was an invention of power and influence, almost all of the influential, getting paid leftists, neoconservatives, their purpose is, you ask, what do they conserve, or what have they conserved? What they are there to conserve is to police the right wing and say that if there's been a battle fought in the past, like for public school integration, or for women's rights, or for homosexual marriage, or whatever the liberal cause du jour was, that is now off the table. You can't criticize public school integration anymore, although there's plenty of grounds for questioning the wisdom of the Brown versus Board of Education decision and its progeny, because public education has gone in the toilet over my lifetime, basically because of public school integration, which was one of the first great victories of the left, and supposedly, one that is like Caesar's life beyond reproach. You can't criticize it. They're there to enforce that. You can't criticize that anymore. There's already been a decision about it. The thing that gets me about this is that if that were the case, abortion would also be beyond the pale, because we have a U.S. Supreme Court decision saying that that's all right. It's like they let that one particular topic be something that good, civic-minded, Chamber of Commerce conservative can be opposed to, is abortion. Having fought that battle and lost it is the thing that, determines what is good and what can be still criticized and what can't. Well, then abortion would be just like public school integration and homosexual marriage and everything else. It would be beyond the pale, but it isn't. It's like they let you have something. What they're scared of are paleoconservatives like you and me that say that everything that was on the table in 1950, as far as I'm concerned, is still on the table and subject to investigation and subject to criticism when necessary or when merited. So consequently, that's what neoconservative, that's the only thing they can serve. They will put up a kind of token opposition to the latest liberal cause. But like, I remember when Max Boot was saying, forget about homosexual marriage. And this is back when they had 31 states have initiatives and referendums about it, and 31 states, including liberal strongholds like California, voted against legitimizing homosexual marriage. Then, the thing that is so bad about the Brown decision, Brown versus Board of Education, is that it created the template. It's like the discovery by an alchemist in the Middle Ages of the Philosopher's Stone. It was the foolproof way to get liberal change made into the law without winning elections or convincing legislators. You could go to the Supreme Court and get them to make the decision, and everybody just, fell into line about it. That was a big loss right there that people didn't, and there was plenty of opposition to the Brown decision when it came around, and as far as I'm concerned, that's the fundamental liberal conservative issue of the 20th century. The people that opposed it didn't have control of the airway, the broadcast. I remember when I was a kid in college, I had this book by Marshall McLuhan called The Medium is the Message, and we were supposed to read that, and basically it was a very short book, and the message was that if you control the media, the broadcast media, you can control public opinion, and that's exactly what all of these liberal victories over my lifetime and yours have demonstrated, that, if you control the media, you control public opinion.
You want to illustrate that? Look at the Scopes monkey trial. Everybody forgets that William Jennings Bryant won that case in the courtroom. And the reason they forget it is because he was crucified in the newspapers.
That's right. In the court of public opinion, he lost. And, everything was, for example, in the civil rights movement, it was the first time in American history that law enforcement was successfully portrayed as the villains and the lawbreakers were portrayed as the heroes. And it was done through manipulation of media and control of media. But back then you had ABC, CBS, NBC, and PBS. They had this thing called the Highlander Folk School in Monteagle, Tennessee, near where the University of the South is, which was like the Paris Island for civil rights workers. And they basically taught them how to manipulate the media. What they did was they dressed all these black protesters up like Urkel. They all had little white shirts and little skinny ties, and most of the guys had on horn-rimmed glasses and short haircuts. I didn't see a zoot suit among the bunch. The people in the media were complicit, and what they didn't show you is that a lot of these demonstrators are doing things like spitting on the police, throwing cups of urine on the police, dog feces and stuff like this, but the cameras wouldn't start to roll until they provoked some type of reaction from the police, and then the rest of the world saw these policemen with dogs and fire hoses, which, by the way, that's pretty humane crowd control as far as I'm concerned, using fire hoses and stuff like this, not bullets. But they were able, and the way it was reported by ABC, CBS, NBC, and whatnot, Dan Rather, Mike Wallace, people like this, who were all, was that Southerners were the bad guys, the segregationists were the bad guys, and the integrationists were these humble but lovable, righteous and holy people. Black people still to this day have the idea that somehow they won the civil rights movement all based on their own efforts, that basically they just linked arms and started swaying back and forth and singing spirituals and the walls came tumbling down, which is absurd. If it hadn't been for Jewish media control and the way it was portrayed, they would have lost. It would have been just like the Shelbyville, demonstration that the alt-right had after Charlottesville. Shelbyville ran off without a hitch. It was perfect from the alt-right viewpoint, but it wasn't reported on, so it didn't happen. Charlottesville happened, and the left controlled the narrative, and all quote unquote right thinking people came in to criticize the people that were protesting taking down Robert E. Lee's statue. And the way the whole thing was portrayed, it was like it's all Nazis and Klansmen, no legitimacy whatsoever to that type of protest. When basically all they wanted to do was to preserve a statue of a person who was basically had a stainless public record. He was the only man. Robert E. Lee was the only person in the history of West Point to go through West Point without earning a single demerit. If you study his life, he was absolutely, flawless, but he can be taken down. And Martin Luther King, who was a sexual predator, a physical and sexual abuser of women, a plagiarist, a known communist sympathizer who was taking money from the communists, and also a Christian heretic. He basically didn't believe in all the basic standard issues that are covered by the Apostles' Creed, which were, the Apostles' Creed is supposedly the minimum doctrine that you need to ascribe to in order to be a legitimate Christian. He didn't believe in most of those, and he's down in writing about that, but of course, he's this great Christian hero. And just about all denominational headquarters would say that he is, and if you're opposed to him for any reason, that just shows that you have evil in your heart. See, they're in charge of the media. I don't know how we're going to deal with that except by, getting out there and telling the truth, and eventually, people, we get through to an incredible amount of people, but unfortunately our people aren't the wealthy people that control the economy and our society and our culture.
Extra, extra, read all about it!
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.amfree.com www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
You know, even when people do get moved and motivated, like, for example, in Lansing, Michigan, you know, there were thousands and thousands of people there and 2 Confederate flags. There were a few people who had posters of the governor basically, you know, made up to look like Adolf Hitler. And, you know, the truth is she is a dictator. But anyways, or a dictatress or whatever you want to call that. But anyways, you know, so you've got 2 Confederate flags and a couple people with posters that have the governor dressed up like Hitler, and thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are saying enough is enough. And yet, what do we see on TV? Oh, there were all these whatevers with their Confederate flags and their swastikas. We don't know anything else about that day except for the fact that there were Confederate flags and swastikas. You know, of all the things that the news media could be reporting on, you know, they're fixated on those 2 Confederate flags, and they make sure that you think there were 2,000 of them.
Right. One-sided coverage causes people to question the legitimacy of the standard outlook on all of these things. You know, the Barnes Review, for example, it's based on revisionist history, and there is a great market and a great appetite out there for it because people realize that they've been lied to and are being lied to on a daily basis by the establishment, and the establishment is now a leftist establishment and has been.
And so you talk about, you know, the fake news and how the narrative is so swayed that, you know, so slanted that how can you believe it? But yet, how is it that in the midst of the whole pandemic that we're still going through, all of a sudden, what has been fake news is now the most reliable source of information?
We can't compete with them in terms of money and in terms of reach. It takes a little bit of skill to navigate the internet, and that's where our information is. You turn on CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, you're either going to get neocon or left-wing viewpoints. Without that validation, or the validation that you used to get in, like, daily newspapers are dying. They deserve the death that they're suffering. Basically, we don't have, there aren't any conservative daily newspapers now. Back in the 50s and 60s there were, but they were bought up by chains, and the first thing they do is fire the local editor and put some guy from Portland, Oregon or Portland, Maine in there as the editor, and so the daily newspaper in Jackson, Mississippi or Memphis, Tennessee would have the same editorial slant as the newspaper in Portland, Maine or Portland, Oregon. Money talks and BS walks, as they say, and that's what it really all gets down to. It's just a shame that our nation and the money that it generates has been basically stolen and co-opted by people other than the founding stock of this nation, the descendants of the founding stock of this nation. We don't have the money. Others do. And because of that, they control things.
But just even as a pastor, I can see, you know, in talking to people that, you know, the typical person who came to church, they didn't necessarily believe most of what they were seeing on television or reading in the newspaper until the whole virus. And then all of a sudden now it's like they believe everything. And even in the pulpit, I've said it, that you know, that was fake news. What makes it real now? But yet people are like, you know, how dare you question these things?
Well, the thing is, they keep coming up with this and they don't get any validation from the establishment. Nobody says, hey, you're right, you know, this is phony news. Trump will say things like that to a certain degree, but, you know, his chief advisor, his son-in-law, Jared and Ivanka, are just typical Manhattan liberals, and they are the chief advisors for Trump. And that's why Trump is a disappointment, because, you know, he's not taking his advice from Pat Buchanan, people that, you know, Kevin McDonald, for example, or from us. He's taking it from a variant form of power and influence. The Republicans and the Democrats, they own the liberals and the conservatives that are mainstream. So, you know, that's where we are. That's what we got.
Well, you talk about both sides of that. To go back to Martin Luther King, most people did not realize that he was a registered Republican and that Richard Nixon was his perpetual get-out-of-jail-free card.
back in the day, people wonder why Southern whites were Democrats. Well, the Republicans were the liberals. They were the political party of liberty and Lincoln, and the Democrats were the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. Remember that from James G. Blaine and Rutherford Hayes and James Garfield and whatnot, all of that. Grover Cleveland. Back in those days, the Democrats were the populist working man's party, and the Republicans were always the elitist and the establishment people. And, for example, in Memphis, you had the Black and Tan Republican Party club, and that was for blacks and what in South Africa they would call coloreds. And we had a guy named Lieutenant George Lee, a black man who had made it an officer in World War I, lieutenant, so he went around the rest of his life calling himself lieutenant, and he never delivered any electoral votes for a Republican candidate for president. But if a Republican was elected president, his function in life was to get as many local blacks as possible hired by the U.S. Postal Service. Throughout town, you have all these little branch post offices that are Lieutenant George Lee post offices, which are basically confirming, what he did for the black community. People don't understand that, but the two-party system has not worked well for our people. Basically fooled and bamboozled into voting for people that do not represent our interests and really have no intention of representing our interests. Donald Trump, I guess, is the way. I don't think he's intentionally doing it, but basically he is tight with his money. I mean, there's not a day goes by I don't get at least 4 or 5 email letters from his campaign asking him for money. He's not going to be like Michael Bloomberg and finance his own campaigns. And, money talks and BS walks again, and, the people that have the money control him. For example, he instinctively says something that resonates with us, that he's going to shut down immigration because of the pandemic. Well, that sounds wonderful, but 2 days later, he's walking it back because Jared has told him, well, you got to have H-1B visas, H-2B visas, and guest worker visas. Well, that's 80% of the third world immigrants to America covered right there. So, what they say, when all is said and done, more will be said than done. The key to it all is money, and I don't know how you solve that problem, because basically we don't have the money. We could all be contributing as much as we could, and we still wouldn't be able to compare with the money that Jewish Power and Influence is able to muster, through bundling and whatnot. They give almost 90% of the money that the Democrats raise for national office, and around 50% of the money for the Republicans. So they are the biggest source of money, and money will get you an audience in the corridors of power.
Welcome to the Christendom curriculum. Every parent who decides to homeschool wants to secure a great education for their child, while also saving time and money. But these days, many parents have another concern. They also want a homeschool curriculum without all the multiculturalist, politically correct diversity doctrine that's really little more than a thin disguise for an anti-Christian, anti-American, and anti-Western civilization bias. Now there is such a curriculum. The Christendom curriculum gives your children a complete education in Bible, history, literature, and more, focusing on the classic academic skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic. But we also tell the story of Christendom, the story of the Christian nations, especially as Christ's kingdom has been historically manifest in the nations of Europe and America, and we do so without apology. The Christendom curriculum is the only Christian nationalist homeschool program you'll find. We support the right of the European and American peoples to their historic Christian cultures against the globalist leftists who want to destroy those cultures. Not only that, but we provide assigned reading courses for various hot-button subjects in our current culture wars, including feminism, social justice, and cultural Marxism, among others. These reading courses will teach your kids how to survive a social justice warrior attack, how to debate with leftists on social media, how to reform their local churches and communities, and more. We're living in a time of tremendous historical and social change. Christians have the opportunity now to begin building the culture and civilization of the next 1,000 years and beyond. It's an exciting time to be alive. So if you want to help raise the next generation of culture warriors, if you want your children to grow up with a love for Christ's kingdom and for their own nation, while at the same time learning how to defend America and rebuild the West, the easy-to-use Christendom curriculum is for you. Click the Learn More button to get in on the action. And thanks for listening.
You know, another thing, you talk about Michael Bloomberg and Donald Trump and financing their campaigns and not financing their campaigns. If you'll remember, in 2016, the government was giving Donald Trump all kinds of grief. For example, he would fly on his own plane to a campaign, stop somewhere, and, they would give him all kinds of grief that was an illegal campaign contribution. Whereas, Michael Bloomberg could do whatever, and nobody ever challenged it.
Well, look, that just goes to show you that it's not fair and it's not equal. Our society, because, it's not an issue unless the media makes it an issue. And if the media ignores it, which they're always going to ignore the hard leftist position on anything, then in the eyes of most people, it's not an issue. Cultural Marxism is a mixture of Marx and Freud, and the Freudian aspect of it is a key aspect to it. That's what gets Joe and Jane Sixpack on board with their issues. And these people, for example, they think they're conservative. They've ingested so much liberalism, and they are so instinctively liberalism, they don't even recognize the truth of what they are.
Modern day liberalism and modern day cultural Marxism and the modern day, what we're seeing here, is a combination of Marxism and Freudianism. Of course, for years we've talked about, 1984, it's coming to pass before our eyes. And Orwell wrote 1984 as a rebuke of Marxism. But Huxley wrote Brave New World as a rebuke of Freudianism. And so, a lot of what I've seen, especially with this pandemic in the last couple of months, it's not so much 1984 coming to pass. That's already happened. It's Brave New World coming to be. And that's what really scares me.
I was about to say that. I think that Huxley is much more pertinent today than Orwell. And Huxley knew the power of popular culture, too. One of his sayings that a lot of people don't know that I think is really right on target is he said, anything too stupid to be said may always be sung.
That's good.
And think about that. That's, all these things that are, for example, John Lennon's Imagine. If you just put that out there as what he's for in prose, people would laugh at it. But because it's set to music, people get all goo-gooey-eyed and dreamy about it, and they just ingest it. The left knows what they're doing, and they know how to manipulate things that get past our normal intellectual defenses. For example, that's what broadcast media does. See, before you had the written word, either a book or a newspaper, and if you read something that didn't strike you right, you say, well, wait a minute, and you put the paper or the book down for a moment, and you could make up in your mind a counter-argument. You could construct a counter-argument in your mind. You can't do that with the continuous stream of information that you get in broadcast media, on the radio, on the television, or even on a live stream on the internet. People just sit there and we're like a jug being filled up with information. And by the time they're through filling up the jug, you've forgotten the questions you had. That's the pernicious reality of broadcast media.
Right.
Broadcast media is, it short circuits our defense mechanisms.
And so, what do you think is the answer then? I mean, what?
There's not an answer that can work in every way. For example, it would be wonderful, for example, if the internet and the World Wide Web were treated as and things like Facebook and PayPal and whatnot were treated as public utilities. They had to give you access to it. You couldn't get individuals like Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg deciding that I don't like you, so you're not going to be able to, use PayPal or whatever. But, if you do that, then they'll just control, they control the utilities now. No, you don't control the utilities. Money talks and BS walks. And the only key is to have enough money in the hands of people that think like us and are willing to spend it. See, Hollywood, for example, they don't care primarily about making money. They can make a movie like Red Tails, about the wonderful Tuskegee Airmen that was, apparently a squadron of black Baron von Richthofen's, Red Barons and whatnot. They were all excellent. They were shooting down people when actually they were so bad that they were relegated to supply duty because they were not good pilots. But see, they will make a movie like Red Tails that lost tons of money at the box office, and they don't care because they have a role that they think is more important than making money, and that is controlling public opinion and our culture. For example, Quentin Tarantino's movies, solid gold at the box office, and every one of his movies is basically a primer on how non-white people can go about killing white people, from Pulp Fiction on up, Reservoir Dogs, all the way up to this latest one, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And I was wondering about that movie at the time. I said, what is the purpose of this? Because it seems to be kind of pro-white in one way. And then I realized what it was. He basically saw the Manson family, who are the big villains, the ones that get splattered all over the place. It's not quite as obvious as a movie like Inglourious Basterds, where it's, Jewish revenge movie on Nazis. In Tarantino's mind, the Manson family was a bunch of hillbillies, white rednecks, and that's why he was. That's why that movie was made. So you had Tex Watson, and then you had Charles Manson from Texas too. They were just. He has recast them not as hippies and not as leftists, which is what they were, but as crackers and hillbillies. So every movie that type of movie can get made. Movies from a right-wing standpoint, you've got to go back in time, back to the time when America had censor boards, like Memphis had one with a guy named Lloyd Benford. They kept Hollywood in line. Hollywood knew that if they made a morally objectionable movie, half of America wouldn't see it, which meant that their profit margin would be cut in half. So they didn't do it. Hollywood was kept in line. There's some old movies that are wonderful, like the Shane movie, or like Tammy and the Bachelor, for example, which was a chick flick in '57 starring Debbie Reynolds and Leslie Nielsen, set in the South, and is the most positive portrayal of upper-class Southern life that you will ever see Hollywood portray. Not at all like these things like Cat on a Hot Tin Roof and whatnot. But all of this was because we had censor boards that could actually have some teeth, and Hollywood didn't want to provoke them and get their movies banned, because if that happened, half of America would not see the movie, and their profit margin would be cut in half. But then in the late 50s, they got rid of them, and they started putting their poison in movies. For example, Tammy and the Bachelor in '57 was the chick flick of the summer of '57, and it was very wholesome. But that was about the time when all of these censor boards started, the people running them were dying off and weren't being replaced. The next year's chick flick, A Summer Place, was a celebration of adultery. And then the next summer, 59's chick flick, Pillow Talk, with Rock Hudson and Doris Day, if you watch that, they're actually setting the stage for transgenderism, if you can believe that, in 1959.
Well, I was pointing this out back in the 90s, and people were looking at me like I was crazy. One of my favorite television shows has always been the Andy Griffith Show. And we look at that and we say, well, wow, what a wholesome, television show. Here's a father, he's raising his son, and, they go to church on Sunday, and there's always a good moral lesson in it. If you really examine that show, even then, and we're talking 1965, 66, 67, 68, for example, there was one of the episodes where Sheriff Andy is trying to get Opie to come up with enough courage to go to the school dance. Do you realize that in North Carolina in the 1960s, dancing was illegal in every county? As the sheriff, shouldn't he have been shutting the dance down?
Right. Well, what was it? They used to have a joke down here. They said, why are Baptists against having sex standing up or something like that? I forget what it was. And the answer was they're afraid they'll be accused of dancing, But, all of this stuff, Andy Griffin, for example, comes across as Mr. Cornpone, Mr., good old member of Red State America, but he was a flaming liberal. And if you'll notice, if anybody comes out as John Voight, Mel Gibson, whatnot, their career is over. Charlton Heston. That's what Hollywood does. They enforce this. And, if you want I think it was John Travolta or something that said that if you want to have a career in Hollywood, either behind or in front of the camera, you've got to develop a taste for fill in the blank. Okay? This is the way that, we have this corrupt system. Even people like James. James just cannot break away from his affinity for modern movies. He loves them and will always prefer them over old movies. And I tell him the old movies are the only ones that are I would dare show my children, and did show my children when they were growing up, because they were the only ones that had a wholesome message. They had a wholesome message because of those censor boards. And even then, they would try to sneak stuff into them. In a place like Memphis, you have to send your children to private schools, because the public schools are, sending your children there would be like throwing you into the black hole of Calcutta. But the private schools get their teachers from the same schools of education as the public schools, and they're giving the same liberal message now. And then the other option is homeschooling, but you don't find homeschoolers going to Harvard, Yale, or even places like Notre Dame or Vanderbilt. So basically, we are marginalizing ourselves and our children because they're not going to be able to get into positions of power and authority without those type of educational credentials. And this is a problem. It's a big problem. I know a lot of very smart homeschooler kids that are having to do things like be hairdressers or be, electricians or, blue-collar jobs and whatnot. Nobody, you don't see a lot of electricians getting elected congressmen or senators and stuff like this. Opportunities for power and authority in our society are getting away from us because...
Hello, I'm Tom Strain, Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The Confederate flag, Confederate symbols, and the reputation of our Confederate ancestors has come under attack. The Sons of Confederate Veterans is actively fending off our detractors, but there is only so much that we can do. We need your help. Contact your local, state, and national elected politicians and tell them that you will not tolerate these attacks on our heritage. You can also visit scv.org, download an application to join us in our fight to preserve our Southern heritage. Visit scv.org today. If you don't have a Confederate ancestor and you are tired of American history disappearing, you can assist us by becoming a friend of the SCV. Please visit scvheritagedefense.org and make a donation to the Heritage Defense Fund. We hope that you will join us in the fight to defend the Confederate soldiers' good name.
So do you think the answer is to go at the bottom? In other words, For example, you're not going to, be able to work your way through the nominating process of a major political party, which, by the way, thanks to this pandemic, may never actually happen ever again. We're going to have two parties that are going to declare their candidates by proclamation without there having even been primaries to substantiate that. You could potentially, run for mayor of your town, or, go to the city council. In other words, we're going to have to start at the bottom and work our way up.
Running for something like I did, I ran for county assessor because I saw more sovereignty packed into that little down ballot race than just about any other down ballot race. You can control the money that the government gets in a place like Tennessee through that, so it would be very good. But people, you're going to have to dissemble some to to run for something like that, and people saying, he's chicken, he's not doing this, and he's not staying. You can't do it. That just shows me that these people aren't serious about having real power.
Well, I'm going to say something, and he's probably listening, and I'm not being offensive, brother, because I love you. But like Rick Tyler, for example, he's running for president right now. He doesn't have a Chinaman's chance of getting elected as president, but he could probably get elected to the county commission, there in Tennessee. And I'm not saying that he should give up his run for presidency, because maybe he's a voice out there that America needs to hear. But I'm just saying from a statistical probability perspective, sometimes the smaller goal is easier than the bigger one.
Well, if you're serious, you're going to have to start out small and get into it, and you're going to have to dissemble. You're going to have to hide your light under a bushel. And we have all these, keyboard commandos in our ranks who's, you're not bold enough. You're not strong enough. That I'm the brave one, and this, that, and the other. Well, that's not going to work. And you're going to have to, for example, we have Bill Johnson, who always runs for president, and he basically led me to believe that he was going to have money, available for somebody like me running for an achievable office. And I got 40% of the vote, despite being outed as a white advocate. But when all was said and done, more was said than done, he didn't come up with a cent. Meanwhile, he wants to, stroke his own ego once every 4 years and run for president, when, like he said, he doesn't have a Chinaman's chance of getting it. And see, that's the type of thinking that we've got to overcome if we're serious about getting power. But what may happen, the leftist establishment of America is making so many mistakes and making so many enemies abroad that, for example, China could basically foreclose on America. They own all of our debt. And they could run the thing, and basically they could put all of the present political establishment out of business if they do that. It could either be a war, it could be a pandemic, or it could be a financial takeover. But any way that it happens, it could mean regime change, and there might be opportunities there for us. But I'm just telling you that the left is gone so far off its rocker now on, the things that, we're supposed to believe there are 24 genders and stuff like this. No sane person really believes that. But they will pretend to believe it in order to make sure that they can, hoist their flag a little bit higher in the social order. Things are coming to, I forget who it was that said if things can't continue or are unsustainable, they will end. And we have a government, a culture that has departed so far from common sense that I think it's unsustainable. So how it's all going to work its way out, I don't know, but we need to be around to pick up the pieces. The main thing that we can't do anything unless we have children. So we need to have children, and we need to raise children who are instinctively opposed to, the current order of society. We've got to have people that are kind of like secret agents, ready and willing to take over if things, hit the fan, which may happen.
All right. Well, if the last couple of months are any indication, when stuff hits the fan, we've got a whole country full of people, except for a few thousand patriots in Michigan, that is, who are just going to roll over.
Right. That's it. But on the other hand, if the Chinese or the Russians or somebody take us over, or whoever, it won't matter. You know, our establishment will be taken out of power by these outside forces, possibly. That's a possibility. Okay, I don't see. You know, I'm like you. As long as people can, you know, trim their sails and, you know, keep their little jet ski and their little cabin out on the lake, or, you know, their season tickets to University of Michigan football or whatever, you know, whatever rings their chimes, they'll find a way to justify, you know, a retreat on all of these issues. But there are other forces at work that, you know,
for example, during the last couple of months, when almost all of the churches in America were shut down, the church that I was pastoring, I kept it open. But you know what? It didn't matter, because I could count on my fingers and toes the number of people who were coming.
You know, we're good, obedient people. See, that's what happened with the Brown decision. People said, well, you know, if the Supreme Court said it, it must be right. It departed from all standard methodology for deciding an appellate case. It wasn't based on stare decisis and case precedent. It wasn't based on legislative history. It was based on sociology, and really, infantile sociology at that. But it's what the leftist establishment wanted, so it became the law. People are wringing their hands about Christianity, church attendance going down. Well, look, church attendance deserves to go down. Just about every denominational headquarters has exchanged the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John for the Gospels of Peter, Paul, and Mary. You know, liberalism is their true religion now rather than Christianity. And to the extent that Christianity varies from liberalism, Christianity gets tossed aside. And it's not just the Episcopalians or the Presbyterians anymore. As James found out, it's the James Edwards with he and his entire church were thrown out of the Southern Baptist Convention because his pastor would not denounce him and basically excommunicate him from his church. Denominational headquarters, the long march through the institutions has gone through denominational headquarters. Christianity is fine, but, Protestantism is based on two primary principles. One is sola scriptura, only the scriptures, not the creeds or commentaries of men, and the second one is every man a priest. Well, if sola scriptura is one of your foundational principles, you've got to resist the temptation of rewriting the Bible every 10 years, which is what, rather than the King James Bible being the authoritative text. Schofield was a scoundrel, and he was financed by the Lotus Club in New York to go over to Oxford and do his research that resulted in his Bible, and true religion followed Jesus. And Christians are the chosen people. But now they derive that as replacement theology in, Southern Baptist groups and stuff like this. Very hard to find truly Christian church to attend nowadays. And most of the pastors, even if they don't really join on to all of this leftism, they're not candidates for the next edition of Profiles in Courage either. For example, they'll close their church when the government tells them to close their church. Thank goodness you weren't one of those people. But, I could not believe all the churches of America were shut down on Easter Sunday. It was the most incredible thing I thought I'd ever seen.
And now the governor of Illinois is saying that they'll probably be closed at least through the end of 2021 in the state of Illinois. So, on what basis does he declare that? Because there's no scientific basis for that decision. So obviously it's just, the evil in his heart coming out.
They've exchanged the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John for the Gospels of Peter, Paul, and Mary. The folk singing trio from the 60s that provided the soundtrack for the Civil Rights Movement, basically. So you go to the churches, you go to the schools, you go to movie entertainment. The left, cultural Marxism's long march through the institutions has marched through all of these institutions, including denominational headquarters for most churches.
Kind of back to what we had mentioned even before, was recently I had the opportunity to talk to somebody, was a popular musician. they were telling me all kinds of crazy things. I say crazy things, I mean things that you and I would agree with, but it would seem crazy coming from them. But toward the end of the conversation, it's like, but of course, you can't tell anybody that I said this, or, I could never be on your radio show, because if anybody realized that I believed these things, it would be the end of my career.
Well, that's it. That's political correctness, the iron grip of political correctness.